When I made the video covering the Power 5 characters, I received a number of comments asking me who would be the strongest 4-star that wasn't the Power 5, and I would have to give it to Beidou. As discussed numerous times in the past, the early 4-stars of Genshin were among the most volatile when it came to strength and performance, with some completely shattering any preconceptions on unit rarity in gachas like Xingqiu and Bennett, and others being disappointingly subpar like Amber and Ningguang. So it was difficult for everyone to establish a clear benchmark on how to gauge the value of a 4-star, which you can ascertain by looking at any tier list back in early version 1 grievously underrating some of the best 4-stars in the game. One character that has more or less maintained a solid reputation from day 1 though was Beidou, whose interesting moveset allowed players to both find her enjoyable to use despite their lack of understanding of the game, and realize the innate potential within her moveset once they did understand more of the game. Curiously, however, there doesn't appear to be a consensus on where Beidou stands right now, which in all honesty has been a thing she's been dealing with ever since the game came out. Some say she's extremely broken, while others believe she fell off ages ago. This will be the first time in a very long while I'll be covering a 4-star character for this series, as the last one was on Shinobu. So for the next episode of What Happened To, we'll be seeing how well the captain of the Crux battled against the tides of time. In a similar fashion to Mona, Beidou's position was always a rather nebulous one up until recently, or rather she's both a solved character while retaining a lot of latent potential to get better and better. Accentuating this are the unique set of abilities offered by her that are surprisingly unusual for an Electro character. But those abilities are what allowed her to remain a very respectable unit even as the roster became more and more populated. Contrasting from the other units in this series who really only had one job and stuck to it all throughout, Beidou was used for an altogether different purpose back in the day. I mean, I guess you can say that purpose is still used now, but that's not why she's valuable. I'll touch on that again later in the video. For the better part of version 1, back when no one had any idea what the hell they were doing, Beidou immediately stood out as a semi-popular alternative to Racer, who was the top dog damage dealer for most players who couldn't get their hands on Diluc. The main distinction between the two was that Racer was more of a sweeper or the typical berserker class, while Beidou was more of a bruiser or a warrior/knight, whose damage output wasn't quite as high but was compensated by increased resilience. That was Beidou in a nutshell. She wasn't nearly as offense-oriented as Racer, but made up for it through greater survivability, which sort of mattered in the early days of the game as the community sought her out as an on-field attacker. To reiterate, this is in version 1 before there was any semblance of team building. All things considered, Beidou was another carry unit like everyone else, but a decent, if not rather strong option. Tidecaller granted her a shield while entering a stance, whereby upon releasing the skill she would brandish her sword to damage all nearby enemies for Electro that would increase based on how many times she took damage in that stance. When combined with her first Ascension passive, she could instantly max the bonus if she attacked right as she got struck, leading to exquisite damage practically immediately. If memory serves, it's among the highest damaging single attack skills in the game, capping out at 800% at rank 10, which is quite insane for any character, let alone a 4-star, and with a short cooldown of 7.5 seconds, mastery over Beidou's skill enabled players to achieve significant damage numbers at that time, especially in tandem with the 4th Ascension passive granting a 15% boost to both the damage and attack speed of her normal and charge attacks, along with allowing her to transition to charge attacks much faster. Her elemental burst continued that trend with a mixture of offensive and defensive pressure, granting her stagger resistance and reducing damage taken while causing normal and charged attacks to create chain lightning between enemies every second. This allowed her to clear groups of enemies measurably faster than most other characters, and with how the early days of Genshin were focused on clearing groups of enemies in equal parts the overworld and domains, this made her all in all a very self-reliant fighter. Further down the line, she would take more of a backseat role as early records of team building came into play. Something I haven't really talked about much in these history videos is that for most of Genshin's first year, a huge emphasis was placed on finding budget-friendly teams, with at most only one 5-star unit if any were to be allowed at all. Two proof of concept sets spurred from this. The first national team entailing Bennett, Xingqiu Shanling, and Sucrose Chongyun, and the first Taser team with Sucrose, Xingqiu Official, and Beidou. Beidou's ability to give the status effects of her elemental burst to the active character gave her fantastic innate synergy with many units, serving as almost like the Electro version of Xingqiu, albeit with a weirder way of applying follow-up damage. And though this was more of a low-key instance, another team composition she could tag into was Child Fireworks, making use of her rather impressive base damage to clear any dungeon with 2 or more enemies. That was the shining virtue for Beidou. For a 4-star unit, she had surprisingly high damage numbers on her skill and burst. Perfect execution of Tidecaller could deal around 800% at rank 10, and with Stormbreaker she could do over 500% in total with every chain lightning attack that was increased to 860% in Constellation 2, adding 2 extra chain bounces. With an interval of 1 second, that meant Beidou could do upwards of 12,000% over the duration of her burst, assuming once again that there were at least 2 enemies at a time. All that's to say, Beidou may not be as strong as the Power 5, but she certainly came close. In totality, Beidou's first year wasn't half bad. Extraneous circumstances did make it difficult for her to really shine, as she had to deal with the likes of Fischl, Razor, and Kutzing, who each beat her out in some way, shape, or form, whether practical strength, early attention, or character popularity. And lest you forget, Electro had yet to be appreciated, as Cryo and Pyro were the reigning kings of version 1. Fortunately for her though, things were only gonna get better. All throughout version 1, not a single new Electro character was released, leaving us to just Fischl, Beidou, Razor, and Kutzing. Not the worst roster by any means, especially nowadays, but it also meant our understanding of Electro was still very premature. Come version 2, Electro units gradually improved in value and priority, new and old. Yaemiko, Shogun, Sada, and Shinobu expanded on the Electro roster, but Fischl and Beidou maintained their value, although Fischl definitely had a bigger piece of that. It's at this point where, depending on how you look at it, the following events could be interpreted as a downward spiral for Beidou's equity or a testament to how she managed to hold on in spite of it. The advent of Yaemiko brought in a third viable option for taser and off-field electro damage, which meant whether or not one is better than the other, more options meant more of a reason for each character to have to provide a worthwhile incentive to be used. The easiest way to describe this dynamic was that Fischl was a single target DPS expert, Beidou was the captain of AoE DPS, and Yaemiko was somewhere in the middle. She was mostly single target oriented, but had the potential to take on other enemies thanks to each of her Sakura blooms being able to target separate enemies if applicable. This will be more impactful later on when we talk about version 3. Right now though, what made Beidou still a viable and sought after unit was that unlike Fischl, Miko, and essentially every Electro unit before Shinobu, Beidou had defensive utility, which was starting to become increasingly more necessary with the ramping damage of Spiral Abyss, Domain, and overworld enemies and bosses. In any situation necessitating wave clear and/or survivability, you couldn't find a better character than her. However, when fighting only a single enemy such as a boss, Fischl and Yaemiko would make for more efficient choices. The good news is that version 2 would be the year when team compositions became commonplace, and one of the dominant archetypes was Taser, dealing tons of damage in large areas for a relatively cheap investment. And though Taser did receive new variants of these new characters, Beidou would always be a solid choice to throw in. Whether you were doing Ayato Kasaha, Kokumi Kasaha, or Shincho Sucrose, the other half would almost always have Fischl and Beidou, giving her a firm niche to call home during this time. Bear in mind that Dendro had yet to come out, so despite Raiden Shogun bringing newfound attention to Electro, it was still somewhat of an underventured element. Most of its relevance came from the personal strengths of its characters. In the case of Beidou, she was known for having great damage against crowds of enemies and remarkable survivability. There was, however, a noticeable pain point that she had to deal with. As Electro units are known for operating in pairs in almost any team they're a part of, Beidou would often have to swim with a buddy, tagging along mostly with Fischl, and seldom if ever used by herself, meaning she never had a chance to really shine on her own. And that was because she kind of couldn't. Beidou is to Fischl what Xiangling is to Bennett. Not saying she's a hopeless case without her, but part of why Beidou's reputation was so hard to get a hold of was due in part to always playing second fiddle to another Electro character or sharing the spotlight with them. There was one scenario where she could have broken away from Fischl, but for some inexplicable reason, Mihoyo was firmly against it. Though she's still Electro, one character that Beidou could have paired very nicely with was Raiden Shogun, whose elemental burst damage boost from her skill and incredible energy supplementation were absolutely beautiful for Beidou's Stormcaller. They would have complemented each other extremely well, so why didn't they? Because once again, for some inexplicable reason, Shogun's burst-empowered auto attacks would not activate Stormcaller's follow-up chain lightning, disqualifying the two from being paired up with each other. But even so, despite not really being appreciated individually, and even though single enemy domains and floors are growing in number, the fact that Beidou could join up with any other Electro character and accomplish anything demanded of an Electro character underscored just how versatile and useful she was. Also, to be fair, there are plenty of instances where you're fighting groups of enemies, so her only condition that there had to be 2 or more enemies to bounce lightning off of was pretty universal. Version 3 was sort of a mixed bag of good and bad for her. On one hand, it was a huge buff to her for 3 reasons. First, the unique interaction with her burst. Since Beidou's chain lightning is proc-based electro damage, it's unable to strike Bloom Course, which meant you could build full damage on her and field her alongside a second electro unit, typically Shinobu or Raiden Shogun, then go full elemental mastery on them and ensure that they would trigger Hyper Bloom with their more reaction-focused build, while Beidou could deal tons of damage on her own, and the two could battery one another quite nicely. Technically, the focus was more on the Electro unit doing the reactions and not so much Beidou, but it meant she was the least intrusive among the list of possible companions to bring along, which is a big deal. Second, obviously, Electro as a whole. Dendro finally pushed Electro above Cryo and Pyro in value, and Beidou's usefulness in both Dendro reactions instead of just one or the other gave plenty of reasons for her to be used. Finally, third, something a bit less pronounced, but just as if not more important, role compression. What made Shinobu so powerful in version 3 was that she's the only Electro healer in Genshin right now. What do you mean I'm forgetting someone? You must be mistaken. Shinobu is the only Electro healer in the game, so she could do both the job of healing and Electro application at the same time. Role compression and multitasking is getting increasingly more necessary. Beidou could do just that. Damage, Electro application, and defense. On the other hand, version 3 is detrimental to her in some ways too. the Year of Sumeru oversaw the highest number of isolated enemies in Spiral Abyss we've seen to date. I'm aware that Spiral Abyss isn't everything, but it's the only source of endgame content Genshin has, so it does matter. In any case, Beidou being rendered almost non-functional as there's only one target makes it so she's inherently subpar in Abyss floors where even one chamber has only one enemy. So she was reserved only for floors that had large clusters of mobs, which in her defense, there's at least 1 or 2 per cycle. Secondly, kind of like Bediou, by this point there are a ton of options for teams, so Beidou naturally lost market share as she can only really work in Taser or Dendro, whereas someone like Xingqiu could work in a lot more. In no way did that undermine her usability, it's just the game naturally got more saturated over time. All the same, Beidou was still a very solid character, as she could work well with many of the new characters that came out during version 3. I'll hate them, Yao, Sino, Shinobu, who technically came out of version 2 but is for all intents and purposes a version 3 oriented character, Nahida, and so on. Plus, she was still the best Electro companion unit. She could be paired harmoniously with any Electro combo, Beidou, Fischl, Beidou Shogun specifically for Hyper Bloom, Beidou Shinobu, Beidou Kuting, and so on. However, it meant that she was never really the star of the show. She was auxiliary, which meant that she could ultimately be interchangeable with other Electro pairs, Fischl Mikko, Fischl Shogun, Fischl Shinobu, and so on. Hence why some people think she's not that great, while others think that's what makes her so great, her adaptability. Almost like an Electro unit with the same fluidity as a Hydro character. Speaking of Hydro, Beidou could also theoretically be a decent pair with Neuvillette, thanks to his Hydro Pump, activating her Chain Lightning every second while satisfying the Electro Charge requirement for Neuvillette's passive talent. The downside is that fielding 2 Electro characters for Neuvillette, especially at C0, can be tough, and Beidou still needs at least one other Electro character with her. The potential is there though. Aside from that, version 4 hasn't really affected her personally. The unorthodox playstyles of Fontaine's characters is ushering in a new meta that veers away from the hyper-reaction focused comps we had in versions 2 and 3, but Beidou is faring better than most others by virtue of her Dendro synergy. Also, the only Electro unit we're expecting in the future is Clorinde, and with Electro units very much enjoying each other's company like Hydro units do, unless she's blatantly a 5-star Beidou, I don't think the latter is going anywhere anytime soon. So to wrap things up, Beidou was and is a very strong, albeit very situational character. She can be equated to Venti in a lot of ways. Ridiculously overpowered against clusters of enemies, but painfully suboptimal against one target. Thankfully, her party-agnostic flexibility, respectable damage output, especially while off-field, and defensive utility gives her enough equity to remain a viable and worthwhile character to use for Electro teams. What keeps her from breaking past the notion of being good but not the best is mostly Fischl. I try not to compare the two as apples to apples because one is for a single target, the other is for AoE, but generally Beidou has always been overshadowed by Fischl from the very beginning of the game to now, even amidst all the different changes Electro has gone through. I like to use the analogy that Fischl and Beidou are reminiscent of Goku and Vegeta. Fischl is just so good of an Electro character, which in comparison makes Beidou look worse, but I mean, objectively Vegeta still cooks, and so does Beidou. More importantly, Beidou is a good example of how MiHoYo should design a 4-star, not necessarily the best, but merits enough justification to be used based on her niche, just like how Shinobu's niche is for Dendro, but in that niche, almost no one can match her. She's the closest unit to match the Power 5 in strength before Yao and Shinobu came out. Like I said in the beginning of the video, if I had to choose who would take 6th place, it would have to be her, and honestly even with Shinobu and Yao, it would still be her. Beidou is the very definition of a character who is good enough, which is far better than what can be said for most of the other 4-stars in Genshin. That's gonna be it for what happened to Beidou. I think it's a crime she's not a 5-star character given how much of a badass she is in lore. I mean, for crying out loud, she took down a legendary sea monster before she even got her vision. What do you guys think about her career so far? Do you think she's a lot better than people give her credit for, or conversely, do you think people overrate her? Let me know in the comments down below. For now though, if you enjoyed the video, I encourage you to leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @VarsFam, join my Discord server, and check out my other What Happened To episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.